Welcome back to the Holy Post. Were you an evangelical kid in the late 20th century? A new article says you may be suffering from the lingering effects of rapture anxiety. Why did the rapture feature so prominently in the American church? Where did that come from? And why does it seem so bizarre to Christians today? Then, Russell Moore has a new article on the heresy of Christian nationalism, accusing it of doing to conservatives what the social gospel did to progressives a century ago. Then I talked to Silicon Valley pastor Jay Kim about his new book, Analog Christian. All of that, plus why you shouldn't take a raccoon into a bar, and one tough Turkish toddler. Here is episode 529.
Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is the Holy Post Podcast. I'm Phil Vischer. I'm here with Sky Jitani. Hi, Sky.
Hi, Phil.
And Kaylin Shess. Hi, Kaylin.
Hi, Phil.
Are you at home, Kaylin?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're at home? Do you have classes? Are you in the middle of classes?
I left one class this morning to come do this, and then after this, I'm going to drive back to campus for class.
Oh, okay. How far are you from campus?
I'm pretty close, like 7 minutes.
Oh, okay. But you couldn't, not walking distance?
No, it is not walking distance.
Biking distance? Bike?
I probably could bike. I wear dresses too much, though.
Oh.
If only I were a man.
Because those are the rules at Duke, that women have to wear dresses?
They require women to wear ankle-length dresses. At the Divinity School, they do.
Now it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Caitlin.
Book update. Did you turned it in? They haven't gotten any notes back? I did. You turned it in.
Yep.
No notes back, though. Nothing more yet.
So
okay.
I'm not thinking about it until
We're
then.
not thinking about it. Okay. That's fantastic. Have you ever tried to take a raccoon into a bar? You know, when you're bar hopping, like you guys do. Have you ever said, hey, there's a wild raccoon. I'm going to bring it with me bar hopping?
That thought has never occurred to me.
You shouldn't do that. It's illegal. North Dakota woman is charged after bringing raccoon into a bar. Erin Christensen, 38, told authorities her family found the raccoon on the side of the road about 3 months ago and named it Rocky. It was a wild raccoon.
So unoriginal.
I know, Rocky Raccoon. Yeah. Found it, brought it home. Maybe it was sick or something. That's even worse. A sick raccoon.
Worse.
They nursed it back to health, and then she took it out to a bar.
Wait, was the raccoon really sick?
It doesn't really say.
Because they may have just abducted a raccoon.
Yeah, I know. Totally. They just went into a raccoon
village. Took advantage of it.
Yeah, and grabbed a raccoon. Christensen said her family found the raccoon on the side of the road about 3 months ago and named it Rocky. She said they were nursing the animal back to health with plans to release it back into the wild.
That means they hit the raccoon. And it was on the side of the road. And they felt guilty. Yeah.
Yeah, Christensen then took Rocky the raccoon to Maddock Bar on September 6th during happy hour. I mean, that's when I would take a
reasonable.
raccoon to a bar.
Could they argue that the raccoon is like an emotional support animal?
Yeah.
You could, for sure.
Maybe if it was legitimately a pet, but it was a wild raccoon. A wild raccoon is not an emotional support animal. And
it wasn't wild anymore.
It is. Oh, really? If you have a wild animal in your house for a couple months, it's now a domesticated animal. Is that what you're saying?
Train it a little bit.
I'll send a bison over to your house, Sky, and we'll see how that goes.
Don't be exaggerating. A raccoon is very different than a bison.
They're both wild, Sky. They're both wild. It is illegal under North Dakota Board of Animal Health laws to keep a wild raccoon. So, and bringing one into a public establishment, even more illegal. So poor, what's her name? Poor Erin Christensen could be facing up to 2 years in jail.
So what I learned is that Sky and you and I could all potentially take a raccoon into a bar. We just can't take it into a bar in North Dakota.
North Dakota? Maybe. I don't know. Have you checked your local rulings about
I will now.
Raccoon bar hopping?
Have to make sure the raccoon has its shots? So it's
it's wild. It's wild, Sky.
If it has its shots, it's not rabid or anything.
You don't know. It'll bite people.
Did it cause any harm?
No, it didn't do any harm. Even the
Yeah, who
bartender
snitched
said
on her?
it didn't bite
Seriously.
anyone. It was just a wild raccoon enjoying a bourbon. And now,
Those raccoons have opposable thumbs, don't they?
yeah, they do.
It could do
Yeah.
some damage.
Or he could have enjoyed a drink.
He could have mixed his own drink.
Right.
Yeah, a raccoon bartender. That's a themed bar. Wild animals will serve you drinks, and then you go to jail for 2 years. Okay. Some people have complained that kids these days aren't as tough as prior generations. Yeah, have you ever heard that complaint that kids don't have grit and that they're wimpy?
Participation trophies.
Not all kids. Everyone. Toddler bites snake to death after snake bites her.
I love her so
Wow.
much.
A 2-year-old girl in Turkey responded to a snake biting her on the lip by biting it back in return, and the snake died from the toddler's bite.
So it's not an American toddler.
No, it was a Turkish toddler. The toddler from the village of Kantar near Bingöl, Turkey, was bitten on August 10th. According to media reports, her neighbors heard her scream as the snake attacked her in her backyard. When they reached her, they found her with a bite mark on her lip and a 20-inch snake between her teeth.
20-inch. Wow.
Yeah, the
gosh.
snake later died from the toddler's revenge bite, while the 2-year-old was treated in a children's hospital and then released.
That actually sounds like exactly like the most toddler thing ever. Revenge bite. Yeah. Whoever, person,
Yeah.
snake, whatever, sibling, babysitter, bite back.
How dare you? How dare you, sir? Yeah, so maybe there's hope for the next generation, at least in Turkey.
So what you're saying is we need to release snakes into our nurseries
No.
and preschools
Sky.
to weed out the weak ones.
Sky.
Yeah.
That I did not say that, Sky. I did not say that. But I was, it's impressive.
Reminds me when my oldest daughter was very young, one night she kept coming into our bedroom saying that there was a snake in her bed. And I was really getting frustrated because she kept doing this and I kept telling her there's no snake. I was exhausted. It was a bad night. I don't remember what was going on, but finally she did this over and over and over again. And I thought she was just making it up in order to, have an excuse not to go to bed. And I finally yelled at her.
We're getting
There
worried.
was a snake in her bed.
So
We're
then
getting worried.
I go into her bedroom to show her there is no snake in her bed.
Yeah.
And I lift up her pillow and I don't know how this happened, but there was an earthworm under her pillow. It wasn't a snake, but it was an actual
She wasn't
worm.
totally lying.
Exactly. And I just felt like the world's worst father.
My, well, yeah, at least
Protect
top
her
10.
from the earthworm.
My cousin in high school found in rural Michigan, it was her bedroom was in the basement of their house, and she found a baby rattlesnake in her bed.
Oh my gosh.
And her brother took it out with a golf club.
There's rattlesnakes in Michigan?
There are. Yeah, my grandfather killed one on the road in front of his house and gave us the rattle. So anyway,
Yikes.
that's neither here nor there about Christianity in the world and how we live a Christian life, except there's a theme of snake in the Bible. So we can tie that in with the great deceiver, and all you need is a golf club to resist the wiles of the devil. Is that a good lesson?
Well,
Bite back.
it does seem a little tangential to Genesis 3, where it talks about the child of the woman will be bitten on the heel and he will crush its head, right?
Yes.
The proto-evangelion, as they call it.
Yeah.
Proto-evangelion. Yes.
The first gospel.
The first gospel is about a toddler biting a snake to death. And it's
Not totally wrong.
Maybe that's a sign of the end times. Do you think that's a sign of the end times? Can we work that
No.
into eschatology in any way? The toddler will bite the snake.
I don't think so. But for some reason, the term Turkish toddler makes me giggle. I like that.
Okay. Can we talk about a new phrase, a new mental health phrase? Very exciting. Rapture anxiety. Let's talk about rapture anxiety. Sky, do you suffer from rapture anxiety?
I definitely do not.
This was a story put out by CNN. They interviewed a woman named April, adjoining a 13. When she was 13 years old, she had a sense something wasn't right. It was quiet in her Dallas house, too quiet. Her brothers were gone. Her parents were gone. On her parents' bed, a pile of her mother's clothes signaled something terrifying. Joy's mind began churning, trying to remember, trying to make plans. When was the last time she had sinned? Should she refuse the mark of the beast? At least she thought if she was put to the guillotine during the time of tribulation, it would be a quick death. 13-year-old April freaked the heck out.
When was this? Back in the 80s?
This was like 20 years ago, 20-ish years ago. She's 38 now, so 25 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, so not quite the 80s. It's a little late for that. I do remember, because they interview people that watched, read the Left Behind books or watched the Thief in the Night movies. And the Thief in the Night movies were when I was a kid. Left Behind books were when my kids were kids.
Yeah.
And I was right in between those.
Rapture anxiety. Was there anything in your time? Because I also had Late Great Planet Earth and 1984 Countdown to Armageddon.
Yeah, all of that
Lindsay.
stuff was still floating around for sure.
Yeah. Rapture anxiety, as it is often called, is recognized by some faith experts and mental health professionals as a type of religious trauma. One says, our research has revealed that religious trauma leads to an increase in anxiety, depression, paranoia, and even some OCD-like behaviors, like I need to say this prayer of salvation so many times, or I need to confess my sins every day, so I make sure that I don't have a sin hanging out there when Jesus comes back, and then I'm doomed. They mentioned the Left Behind books. They thought that Joy's thought of a guillotine seemed oddly specific until you realize it's featured in a graphic execution scene in the film A Thief in the Night. What have we done to our children? The children of the 70s and 80s. Joy, who still identifies as a Christian, first questioned rapture theology when she was in her late teens and discovered that the word rapture doesn't appear in the Bible at all. Years later, she mustered the courage to ask a question in a closed Facebook group. Did anyone else ever genuinely think they got left behind as kids? The post received hundreds of responses. So many people said, I thought I was the only one. So... How many kids did we traumatize?
Most of them.
Yeah. And you know what's funny? I grew up reading Left Behind books. I read the teen books and then I read the adult books. But I only just recently watched A Thief in the Night. For doing research. Yes.
Or
I
watched a drunken dare.
No. For research. Okay. Just because it was fun doesn't mean it wasn't for research. I watched all the Thief in the Nights, and then I watched the different iterations of Left Behind movies, too, and reread some Left Behind. The interesting thing to me, watching the first A Thief in the Night, was not only how strange and enjoyable it was to watch it, but also, and the very creepy Larry Norman song, Wish We'd All Been Ready, was so creepy.
Life was filled with guns and war, and everyone trampled on the floor.
You really captured the vibe there, Phil. That was good.
I wish we'd all been... We used to sing that song in church. That's how
terrifying.
Popular that song was terrifying. In the 70s.
But you know what's so interesting to me was there's a scene in that movie, in the first A Thief in the Night, where a little girl comes home, and her older sister just became a Christian at like a revival thing. She comes home and the kettle on the stove is going off and there's like things kind of amiss in her house and no one is home. And she starts like freaking out because she thinks the rapture has happened. And then her mom and her grandmother come in and they comfort her and they sit down on the couch and she prays a prayer. And I always wondered if like that scene was why I don't think I ever actually experienced this in youth group, but I heard about it a lot and we talked about it a lot, about putting on fake raptures, like leaving clothes draped on chairs and doing something weird at camp. So when someone would wake up, they would think the rapture had happened, and genuinely thinking that could be evangelistically powerful. And I'm wondering now if that's partially from this movie, because in the movie, it's a perfect evangelist. Like she's totally freaked out. It makes her very ready to accept Christ.
Can I ask a bizarre question?
Yes, Sky Jatani.
I mean, I did not grow up with this anxiety, maybe partly because most of my family...
You didn't grow up in our little subculture.
No, well, not entirely.
You moved into it.
Well, my mom was a Christian, but most of my family and community were not. So the idea of being left behind, I'm like, well, I'm still going to be hanging out with most of the people that I enjoy the most. So
Really?
it didn't. I wasn't traumatized by it.
Did you honestly think that if you were left behind, you would still have fun because all the fun people don't go to
Did you
heaven?
think about
Is that
being
what
left
you?
behind?
'Cause
No.
that's okay.
Yeah.
No, I didn't. But here's the
Okay.
part that I've never really understood. Why does everyone think they're going to be raptured naked?
What?
Like, why
that's a
are the
good question.
why are the
That's a good
clothes
question.
left behind? I
Oh.
don't get that.
It's a weird, yeah.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
it shows up in a ton of them.
I know.
Must
I
have
don't
been
get it.
Scenes and that
Or
they
like
saw.
fillings in your teeth, or like they really thought through every detail of like anything that is not just physically you would
Wow.
I don't get
Left
that at
behind.
all.
It's
Why
weird.
is that? Why is that irrelevant?
Yeah, and when we show up in heaven, what clothes are we wearing? And is it just like first century clothes, like robes and things? You know, because we always paint pictures of heaven with-
Togas.
yeah. Anywho, it's interesting to see CNN turn their attention to this phenomenon for some reason. Why? When did we start using fear as a motivator for a love relationship with Jesus?
I'm guessing that goes back quite a ways.
Yeah. And is it because the love part just wasn't working? It's just not effective enough?
When you want to control people, fear is a better method, for sure.
But I also like, as someone who was definitely not alive during a lot of the like early versions of this, like, you know, 60s, 70s into the 80s interest in dispensational theology and in the rapture and in the relationship to the Cold War. Doing all this research was helpful because I went to a dispensational seminary, and I felt like all of us kind of joked about, even the people who were really bought into some of the theology, we kind of joked at like the 70s, 80s versions of this stuff is ridiculous. I gained a little more sympathy doing my research in terms of both, I didn't live through the period of like real fear over nuclear weapons and like,
Right.
what does that mean for how our whole world and community has changed? And then also realizing if you had been in kind of dispensational circles and you think Israel's really important, and then at some point in that Israel becomes a nation and then later regains Jerusalem, it makes sense that you would be pushed further into like, okay, let's do the timelines and let's figure out I can just imagine both being like, I'm so scared of the world ending in a violent, horrific way. I'm very comforted by the idea that I will be plucked out of it beforehand.
Right.
And parts of scripture that feel very foreign to me and have no applicability to my life suddenly are alive and real and important. And I think we, in our response to some of the wackiness of that period, have not done a good enough job of saying, this scripture does still very much apply to us. It doesn't apply in the kind of kooky ways we thought it applied, where we were like almost conspiracy theory, putting red strings between newspaper clipping. Like, there's a better way it applies to us.
Yeah.
But that was a real, I mean, that makes sense that would be appealing to
Well,
people.
think
This is
about it.
relevant.
Think about it. You know, we get the Scofield Study Bible around 1910, 1919, something like that. And it's got, you know, dispensational charts in the back. So all of a sudden we're thinking about, the signs of the times. Then we get nuclear bombs in World War II. And then the Cold War starts. And then Israel becomes a nation again. So
It makes sense.
If you've still got your Scofield Study Bible open, and you know, Jerry Falwell was still pushing Scofield Study Bibles on TV, you know, in the 1960s. So everyone was looking at what was happening and saying, aha, here, on here, and here. You know, and it's kind of like the way, you know, the ancients came up with constellations, and then you would see things in the stars. It's like, well, just connect the dots. Obviously, it's a fish up there. It's a giant fish up there. And you just connect the dots between Russia and China and Israel and the gays and I don't know, whatever else you want to throw in there. And it's only a matter of time. And are you ready?
I think
you ready, Guy?
The only missing ingredient that you didn't identify there is historical ignorance.
Yeah.
Because you had to have a community of American Christians who did not know history in order to sell this deception. I'll call it that. Because what I heard when I was young in the church, like in the 80s and 90s, when this dispensational interpretation came up, what I heard is this is what the church has always believed. Yeah. This is what Christianity has always taught.
Oh.
And they did not realize that this was a 20th century convention that did not date back to the earliest centuries of the church. But because they were historically ignorant, they could buy that lie to think, oh yeah, the church always believed Israel would be reconstituted, and they always believed in this view of the rapture and what I prefer to call premature resurrection. But it requires biblical and historical ignorance.
Even the significant place of Israel changed in the sense that the Scofield Bible edition before Israel became a nation said that was an event that would happen after the rapture. Oh. And then the edition of the Scofield Bible that came out after that happened now put that pre-rapture as an important sign that the rapture was coming. So even that's
what we
changed our minds
was,
about those kinds of things. And we have historical ignorance about how often throughout history in politically tumultuous times, Christians have been convinced that the end times were immediately coming, and we're wrong. And so for us to be like, we're living in the end, of course, we're going to have the hubris to think that the end times are our generation, but we have to realize we're not the first people to do that.
I talked to my mom earlier today on the phone, and she said, did you hear about such and such that's going around the internet? And I'm like, I have no idea. I'm not on your algorithms. And she was explaining that there's all this hype now about another.
Wait a minute. I'm not on your algorithms. I think that's the quote of the day. I'm sorry. I'm not on your algorithms.
So apparently there's stuff going around right now about, Jesus is coming back right now, sometime like immediately or whatever. And
because of Russia?
I don't know. It's because
the McRib coming back
some
again?
Some YouTube prophet is saying who knows what to drum up their sales.
Okay.
And thankfully my mom is not buying into that either. But and I asked her, how do people keep falling for this over and over and over again? And
historical ignorance is a pretty good suggestion.
That's part of it, but it's also, to Caitlin's point earlier, it's comforting. It's what people want to believe because they look at things that are happening and they just don't want to deal with it. And the easier solution is to say, oh, well, I don't have to worry about it because I'm getting out of here soon.
Yeah. Yeah.
It does make it weird, though, then that we would spend so much time on timelines for what happens after the rapture when our comfort is in not being there for any of it. It's a weird sense of, a lot of the scholars I read when I was doing research on this talked about how a lot of the evangelicals that were a part of this, in some sense, said they weren't date setting. And Hal Lindsey set some dates. He was just sort of vague about it. But a lot of them said, I'm not date setting. But because people want certainty, we crave the control over our lives to think the Bible gives an outline very clear of what's going to happen. At least we could do that post-rapture and get some sense of control. And then no one's accountable for if it's wrong, because that's, inaccessible time to us.
So here's a fun thesis. Obsession with end times theology gave us modern young earth science. Discuss.
Well,
here's how.
Vague.
Yeah, it is very vague. Here's how. Okay. The Millerites were waiting for Jesus to come back in 1838, 1839.
Are they the beer people?
No, they're not the beer people. They were followers of Donald Miller, who wrote Blue Like Jazz. No, it's just, I don't know who they were. They're just Millerites. They followed a guy named Miller, and it was a whole movement in Canada and the U.S. that Jesus is coming back in 1830. 1840. They had magazines, they had newspapers that they were printing. The first date came and went, and Jesus didn't come back. He didn't get the memo. He didn't read the right newspapers. So they changed it to the next year. Next year for sure. So people left their denominations, formed a new sort of religious community, sold their belongings, waited for Jesus to come back. There were leaders and sub-leaders within this new religious community. It was like a whole new denomination of Millerites. He didn't come back. Everyone got disillusioned. Some went back to their old denominations. Some left the faith entirely. Several founded Seventh-day Adventism. So Seventh-day Adventism was born out of disgruntled Millerites. One of the leaders of Seventh-day Adventism was a woman, a former Millerite, who was claimed to be a prophetess. She prophesied about the creation of the geological stack, the geological column, and how it buried everything that became coal and gas was all buried by Noah's Ark, or by the Noah's flood. And that laid the basis. Her prophecy turned into a geology textbook in the 1920s, which turned into another book in the 1960s, which gave us modern young earth creationism. So maybe no Millerites waiting for Jesus, no creation museum in Kentucky. I'm just going to say that. Pretty interesting, huh?
Well,
it's pretty compelling, Caitlin.
What's pretty compelling is the reality that bad theology yields more bad theology.
Begats.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm moving on. Russell Moore just put out something this morning. Hopefully you had a chance to glance at it because it's a really nice article on, he took on Christian nationalism. Our friend Russell Moore took on Christian nationalism, not just in the U.S., but around the world. And I hadn't really thought about this as an example of Christian nationalism, but the head of the Russian Orthodox Church made headlines a couple of weeks ago when the church's patriarch declared that dying in Ukraine as part of Putin's invading army, quote, washes away all sins. So kids, Russian
That's
kids.
so medieval.
I know.
Yeah.
It is. It's exactly what they said for the Crusaders.
Right.
If you die in a Muslim land trying to defend the Christian faith, you're straight to heaven. Straight to heaven. And it was a way to get, people that were unsure about their salvation to sign up for military service.
I mean, are there Russians out there who hear that and go, sign me up. I'm ready to die?
There's always somebody.
I don't know.
I guess.
There's always somebody. And then, hadn't really struck me as Christian nationalism, but it's using Christianity to advance nationalism, to advance, the specific needs of your nation, Pacific and Atlantic needs of your nation. And then he compared it to Giorgia Meloni, who looks like she's going to be the new prime minister. Does Italy have prime ministers? Is that what they have?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The new prime minister of Italy, who's a populist and the most rightish. I'm not going to say far right because some people think that's a slur or an insult, but she's farther to the right than any leader in Italy since Mussolini. The populist movement, as represented by this party that won the election in Italy, is cemented with a particular form of religion, namely those who declare themselves to be religious but are not practicing. This group makes up 52% of the Italian population. So this is the group that elected someone who's running kind of on a Christian nationalist platform. It's people that don't use Christianity as a religion. They use religion as a symbol or identity marker without actually practicing it. And that's an interesting concept because even in the U.S., when you hear people talk about, America is supposed to be a Christian nation, we need to bring Christian values back to schools and back to everywhere, what you almost never hear mentioned is Jesus. They don't talk about Jesus. They talk about Christianity. And that's really curious to me. We're more excited about advancing Christianity than about promoting Jesus or explaining who Jesus was.
Right.
Because the way he lived doesn't necessarily line up very well with taking back our country or saving Western civilization from Islam.
Right.
Or taking political power.
That's the issue, is when you identify your cause as Christianity, what you're declaring you're against are things like Islam or secularism or progressivism. But when you say
globalism,
right.
Jesus hated globalism. We know that.
When you say my cause is Jesus, well, that doesn't work as well.
No.
Because last I checked, Jesus loves secularists and Muslims and globalists. And so then it's not as easy to demonize.
Yeah. Russell says, the term Christian nationalism refers to the use of Christian words, symbols, or rituals as a means to shore up an ethnic or national identity. And that's very similar to Jamar Tisby's definition that we read a couple of months ago. That's a pretty good definition, that it's really about national identity or ethnic identity more so than, a lifestyle of cruciformity, of putting others first, and staying like you said this a few weeks ago, Sky, we don't want to stay on the cross. We don't like it up there. We want to come down from the cross and pick up a sword and stick it to people. He says that the more extreme ends of Christian nationalism are people who make explicit theological pronouncements as a prop for ethnic and nationalist authoritarian aggression, like Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill. And then he says, he has a couple of really good quotes in here that I really liked. He says, Jesus walked away from those who wanted to use his gospel for political liberation or for material prosperity. And then this paragraph, I love this paragraph. Despite their self-perceived opposition to the social gospel of old, Christian nationalists embrace the exact same view of the gospel. For the social gospel-oriented leftists, Christianity exists to build a new social order in step with the upward progress of humanity. For the Christian nationalist right wing, Christianity exists to build a social order in step with national or ethnic identity. So they're both doing the same thing. Basically, he says the gospel is the means for a forward-looking utopianism in the one case and a backward-looking nostalgia in the other case. And then he finally says, this is a kicker, Christian nationalism is a liberation theology for white people.
Caitlin didn't like that line.
I don't like that line at all.
Because you are not entirely opposed to liberation theology, right? Because you were reading Cone.
Yeah, Cone is a little different than Latin American liberation theology.
Yeah,
My issue with that paragraph, and I really like the piece, and I really like Dr. Moore. And I really appreciate that the earlier part that you read, where he's making this connection between social gospel movement in the U.S., like 19th, 20th century social gospel movement, and this, because I have been kept coming up to that kind of parallel in a lot of my research this summer, and asking people who were doing more contemporary work on Christian nationalism if they were looking at that, and a lot of them were not. They were really focused on this as a contemporary kind of sociological thing and not thinking about it historically in the U.S. And I think we're missing something really important to make this parallel, because a lot of evangelicals think of the social gospel as antithetical to us, even though most of the social gospel is pre-fundamentalist modernist split. So there's evangelicals involved in the social gospel. There's no clear mainline evangelical camps like there are today at that point. So evangelicals are very involved. And the language of Christianizing America, Christianizing the social order, all of that kind of very paternalistic, just because it had sort of different social aims, the form of it was very similar. And it was mostly wealthy theologian, relatively wealthy, of a higher social class, theologians and pastors on behalf of the working poor, but really the working poor were not very involved in it. So there was lots of problems with how they thought about what they were doing.
They were the beneficiaries of the largesse and
that's
charity. It was the benevolent empire.
It still is a continuation of that way of thinking.
Upper class white Christians are going to lift up our poor brethren, to, maybe not to our level, but, at least halfway there. Higher.
And it's very similar to how a lot of Christian nationalist people today are in wealthy contexts, are in elite institutions, but say that they are really operating on behalf of the rural Christian poor people that, but they don't have a connection to them necessarily. They're not really part of that community. So I love that parallel. My problem, as you sort of said, Phil, with the liberation connection is that those are not comparable or the same kind of movement. And in one paragraph, I think, I know Dr. Moore knows this, but I think people reading might get confused and think those are the same thing when they are very different, have a different history and a different political context. But more importantly, so central to liberation theology, especially different theologians in Latin America. It's a diverse movement, so I'm speaking very generally, but important generally to that movement is the idea of recognizing where the Spirit of God is at work in the world today, and recognizing that that is most often throughout all of history among the most poor and marginalized. And I think he makes this connection to say white Americans feel like they are the embattled, marginalized people who need a gospel of liberation to free them. The problem with that is I think it continues to make it seem as if liberation theology is just theology that cares about social and political liberation. And I don't want people to get confused and think that that's a problem or that that's completely antithetical to the gospel. I don't think Dr. Moore would say that. I think there are social and political implications of the gospel that are important. But central to liberation theology is that it's not just liberation as a general concept, but that especially important are the perspectives of the poor and marginalized who have a parallel to the perspectives of the people who originally received the revelation of God that we now receive as scripture. Their position is similar, their perspective is similar, and that's an important way of discerning what is God doing now. Is God working through this new prime minister of Italy? Is God working through Trump? Is that a miracle? That's we have to make decisions about where God is working. And liberation theology says we should look at a certain kind of people to discern where the Spirit is moving. And that's very different than the social gospel that said, we pretty privileged, wealthy people know how to fix the world and we will take it over and make it Christian.
Interesting. That sounds like, sorry, hang on. That sounds like the need for the next Caitlin schools us all is to teach us what is and isn't liberation theology.
I think it's important, and I think we throw it around and we don't know what we're saying.
It's definitely demonized, and
Yes.
I haven't ever dug into it enough to say for sure. You know, is it 100%? It's like CRT. Is it 100% evil? 80% evil? Is it a tool of something? What's the good part of it that we shouldn't throw away when we throw it out the window?
And one of the good things that we shouldn't throw away is like a lot of prominent, especially Catholics, because in Latin America, at least, this began as a Catholic theological movement. A lot of more conservative Catholics, one of their main criticisms, other than saying that it's Marxist, and that's a whole other thing we could talk about, but their main criticism is actually not very often that it's Marxist. Their main criticism is like, you take the Bible too seriously. Like you keep acting like when Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor," that was serious.
That was
and
literal.
we need to stop caring so much about that. So
Hey,
I think there's room we can learn from that.
You're infringing on my brand there a little bit, Caitlin, with what if Jesus was serious?
You'll get a cease and desist
About liberation.
letter.
Let's do that.
Well, okay. I think the CRT thing is a pretty good example, Phil, or an analogy where there is a form of liberation theology which is biblical and admirable, but there are so many newer permutations and divergences from that get really wacky, and that's probably what Russell Moore is engaging here in this paragraph. But going back to the original argument, though, that I think he's absolutely correct about, is in both these cases, on the right and on the left, what people are doing is they're trying to use Jesus and use Christianity and use the gospel to further a social or political or national agenda. And that is fundamentally different than saying my allegiance, first and foremost, is to Jesus Christ and his gospel. And I understand that as an overflow or the fruit of that allegiance, there is going to be social implication, and there's going to even be cultural good that comes out of allegiance to Jesus. So in a way, it's putting the cart before the horse. It's saying, I want to use this Jesus to achieve my own ends. It's idolatry. It's just flat out idolatry. You are asking Jesus to bend the knee to your idol, which in this case is American conservatism, or in the social gospel, American progressivism. And that's what's so sinister about this. Yeah.
I think, especially as we're headed into the midterms and we've got another season of political ads and, people trying to score sound bites on cable news, keep track of how often people say Christian or Judeo-Christian and how seldom they say Jesus. Because we've lost the center of the gospel. If it's some values or a lifestyle or a culture that we're afraid of losing, and it's not a relationship that absolutely turns upside down our value system. Okay. I don't want to go on much longer because we're trying to, keep these a little shorter. Some of them are getting a little too long, don't you think? Maybe we're trying to keep them a little shorter. Do we have a guest today, Sky?
We do have a guest today, Phil.
Is it wonderful?
I don't know because I haven't talked to him yet.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's going to be great. I bet. Caitlin, will you do one of your educational segments on liberation theology? I think that would be
that's a
really
great idea.
Interesting.
They're called Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess.
Getting Schooled. I forget if it's
one
Caitlin.
of your educational things. I like that's a good.
Yeah, it's like Schoolhouse Rock with Caitlin Chess.
I like that.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
And just so everyone knows, those are exclusive for our Patreon supporters. So if you haven't signed up, you need to.
Yeah, and then we delete them an hour after they post. So you got to be there right when they post. Right, they're like true. Snapchat. Just they're gone. Woo! Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, they're still there. You can go. How many are there now? How many have we done?
How many have
3?
we done? 4?
I think 4.
4? Oh.
We're doing a dispensationalism one soon.
That's fun. Oh. That's fun because I think the turnover from postmillennialism to premillennialism is one of the reasons that the social gospel split off from conservative Christianity. And that's fascinating. And Caitlin's going to tell you all about it, and you're going to love it, and it's going to make so much sense. And so look forward to that. Okay. Caitlin, have fun at school. Sky, hope you feel better. Your voice is a little, you're not quite feeling.
That's why I haven't talked to our interview guests yet, because I was too sick earlier this week.
Oh, yeah, right. And everybody else, thanks for the support on Patreon. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Desmond Tutu, who was the Anglican Archbishop in South Africa, once said, "There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in." That's great wisdom, and it applies to what we're seeing in the American church today. There are plenty of voices who are talking about the various challenges we're facing, but far fewer voices that are willing to go upstream and ask, why are we in this situation in the first place? Is there a common cause behind a lot of the problems we're seeing? Well, that's where my guest Jay Kim comes in. Jay is the lead pastor of Westgate Church in Silicon Valley, and perhaps because of his position there, he sees the effects that technology is having on our culture, and especially those inside the church, and he's written a series of books about it. The first was called Analog Church. It came out in 2020, and his follow-up book is Analog Christian, Cultivating Contentment, Resilience, and Wisdom in the Digital Age. Now, obviously, not every problem in the church today is caused because of digital technology, but most of the problems we are facing have certainly been made worse because of digital technology. And Jay's book walks through how digital technology warps us and moves us in the polar opposite direction of what Christ is forming us to be, and what it takes to intentionally combat its effects in our lives and in our communities. His book covers a lot of ground that we didn't have time to cover in our conversation, but Jay stuck around for a bonus interview where we talk about the way that dating apps are fundamentally changing the way humans interact with one another sexually, perhaps for the first time, at least if the historians are to be believed. So if you're a Patreon supporter, you can look forward to that bonus segment this week. And if you're not a supporter, please go to holypost.com, click support us, get access to that great bonus interview, along with all the other amazing bonus content we have, the live streams, the book club, and exclusive merchandise. Again, go to holypost.com and click support us. Okay, here's my conversation with Jay Kim. Jay Kim, welcome to the Holy Post.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. Glad to be on with you.
I'm glad you're on with me too, because we've had to reschedule this at least once, maybe twice. So
Right.
I apologize for that, but thank you for your flexibility. Okay, so your new book is Analog Christian, Cultivating Contentment, Resilience, and Wisdom in the Digital Age. This is coming on the heels of Analog Church, which came out 2020, right around the pandemic.
Right at the pandemic, March of 2020. Yeah, 2 weeks after we shut down.
Did you expect to become a champion of the alt-right and the anti-Biden forces who insist on not social distancing, masks, or digital church?
Oh my gosh, it's been strange. Yeah, it's been a strange couple of years. I am certainly not their champion, but yeah, I think the first book, Analog Church, it found a strange place in the conversation. I think mostly people came away not knowing what to think of me. Who I am and where does this guy stand on any number of issues, and I quite enjoy that, actually. So there you go.
Okay, so there's a lot I want to talk to you about, so I don't know how much we'll get to, but we'll do our best. Maybe we'll stick around for a bonus segment if we have to. But the very, very beginning of your new book, Analog Christian, you open up with this analogy about cigarettes and how prior generations, cigarette smoking was widely accepted. There was no one who really seriously questioned it. Eventually, as the evidence mounted that it's unhealthy, you start getting more laws and regulations and warnings and Surgeon General things on packets, whatever, to the point where today fewer people smoke than ever, at least in the United States, and it's generally frowned upon. It's universally agreed as unhealthy. And you kind of make a comparison to cigarette smoking and where we are with digital technology and our smartphones and screens.
Yeah.
You don't say this explicitly, but I really wanted to ask you, do you think we're on a similar trajectory with technology where we're in this phase of it's an unregulated Wild West and everyone's just indulging without thought of consequence? And are we actually going to get to a place of real wisdom and limitations and boundaries on this stuff?
I mean, I don't know for sure, but I ponder it often. Yeah, I really do. I mean, there's actually a lot of research. It kind of parallels and mirrors what began happening, 50 years ago or something with cigarettes. There's that really, really famous at this point article in The Atlantic from the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. And I'm going to butcher the title, but it was so great. It was like, 10 reasons or reasons why the last 10 years of America have been so stupid or something like that.
Right.
And he cites in the article data. He's a data guy, he's a researcher, he's a numbers guy, and he cites sort of the parallel rise of anxiety and depression amongst all people, but especially amongst emerging generations, and how there's literally a parallel line with the increase in anxiety, depression, isolation with the rise of the smartphone. You go back to 2007 when the iPhone comes out, and we're early, right? That was 15 years ago, so we're still somewhat early. We're still sort of tracking the trends, but it feels like everything is pointing in that direction, that we've put these little black boxes in the back pockets of 12-year-olds, and it's ruining them, and it's ruining us, no matter your age. So again, we're sort of on the early end in terms of like the long arc of history, but it does feel like the early trends are pointing in that direction, which is why I posed the question, are we going to look back 50 years from now and just be alarmed, at putting these little things in the back pockets of kids, and our own back pockets. And yeah, I do wonder that often, and it feels like the trajectory is headed that way.
I think the comparison can go even further, where, like cigarettes, it was physicians who were giving early warnings of what they were seeing, right? With people getting lung cancer and emphysema and heart disease and all these other things caused by cigarettes. Similarly, it's the pediatricians, it's the psychiatrists, it's the medical professionals who are going, hey, this is hurting us. The American Pediatric Association has come out with they keep moving the guidelines more and more strict about how much time kids should be on these things.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the interesting bits of your biography and your current ministry is you grew up in and currently live and pastor in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
So, you're speaking from sort of the belly of the beast here.
Yeah.
My question is, when you were growing up in that place, given the industry there, was this question about technology a part of your church life? Was it a part of your formation? Was it a part of your discipleship because it was sort of the epicenter of this industry? Or like the rest of us, was it just not on the radar for the church?
Yeah, it really wasn't on the radar. It wasn't. I think for me, the one thing about living here, growing up here, I've been here basically my entire life, wasn't born here, but moved here before I can remember. I grew up in a single parent home. It was just my mom and I, and she was an immigrant and trying to make ends meet. So we lived for a long stretch of my childhood. When I was in elementary school, we lived with my uncle and my aunt. And my uncle worked for IBM for many years and would bring home these, personal computers. And I was just a curious kid, so I would ask him about it all the time. So I remember having a fascination with technology, digital technology in particular, pretty early on. So that was the one sort of influence on me, sort of geographically, living here and having a family member who worked in technology and just kind of growing up with that early on. But no, it was not a conversation. The dialogue, especially and specifically the dialogue at the intersection of digital technology and our ecclesiology, and digital technology and discipleship and formation, that conversation is just as new to me as it is to most other people. It feels like it's really ramped up in the last several years. And then when, the pandemic sort of forced everybody online, obviously that accelerated the conversation quite a bit. So yeah, I think my experience was like most other people's experience. Computers were computers, and that's a thing. And then we have our spiritual life or our church life or whatever. It hasn't been until, the last few years. But, the one benefit has been, like you said, I live in the belly of the beast. So I'm sitting in my office right now, and our church, we are like a 10-minute drive from the main campus of Apple, like the big sort of spaceship that people have seen online. It's about 10 minutes from here. So there's a very high percentage of folks in our church who actually work at Apple, and then many others who work at other companies nearby, like the big giant sort of mega tech companies like Google and Facebook, as well as, there's a very, very strong sort of startup culture here in Silicon Valley. So many people who work in startup, a lot of our college students and young people here, they're studying computer science, that they want to get into tech. So that's another thing that sort of influenced me as I sort of serve and pastor and shepherd my congregation. Those are the conversations that come up a lot, about technology and about the intersection of their formation into Christ likeness and the stuff they're creating, and some of the sort of ethical dilemmas that some of them feel with, I'm releasing this stuff, unleashing it into the world, and is it making the world a better place? And so it's a fascinating place to live and serve.
Well, what you just shared, I feel really double-minded about, to be honest. In one level, it makes me feel a lot better, because knowing that you and your church and your experience where you are wasn't dealing with this issue any quicker than we were makes me feel like, okay, well, if they missed it, the rest of us missed it, that's okay. On the flip side, the fact that you didn't engage with these issues when you were younger, or the church in your area was, I mean, you had people since at least the 1980s and 90s in the tech world all over Silicon Valley developing these technologies, explicitly understanding that this was going to transform the world, from personal computers to the internet to all these things. So it's in the air you're breathing, and the church is just kind of gliding by and not even paying attention to these kind of history-shattering technologies that are going to completely change the human experience, and the church isn't paying attention to it. That's kind of frightening at the same time. I'm also really grateful to hear that you have people in your church that are asking really good questions, ethical questions about what does it mean to be a Christian in those industries. What do you say to those who, we have a long tradition, especially in American evangelicalism, of believing that media and mediums are neutral, right? The problem isn't television. The problem isn't radio. The problem isn't the internet. The problem is just the messages that are communicated across them. So what do you say to people who argue, well, the internet and digital technology and all that, it's neutral. It's not bad. It's not good. We just need to utilize it for good. And so we need to not worry about people engaging these things, because it doesn't really form them. The only thing that forms them is the content they engage through them. What do you say to that defense of these technologies?
Yeah, Marshall McLuhan, 20th century sort of eclectic social commentator, he famously said, no, the medium is the message. And, in some ways, maybe that's a bit extreme, but in other ways, I would totally agree that the medium is the message. There's this is an academic book that came out many years ago, and I think the title of the book was Church as Theater, and I forget who the author was, but the author sort of traces back. You might know, Sky.
It's on my shelf here somewhere. That's what I'm looking for. Keep talking.
So you've read it. The book basically it does lots of things, but it traces sort of the architecture of the church and how the architecture of the church over the ages has been so influential, and not just influential. There it is. Sky's got it right there.
I've got it.
Church as theater, church becoming theater. Yeah, that's it. Yep. And it sort of it traces back through the ages how the architecture of the church and how the literal physicality of the gathering spaces in which communities of Christ followers would gather had such a tremendous impact on our theology. Not just the physicality of gathering, but on our theology, and our theology of gathering, and our theology of worship. And, so this is not new to digital technology.
Right.
Like the medium does shape not just our experience, but it shapes our ethos. It shapes our philosophy and our theology, the way we think about a particular thing. And what's really interesting to me, and to me in some ways insidious about digital technologies, is that digital mediums, and this is not conjecture. Lots has been written about this already, and there are people like Tristan Harris who talks about this a lot. Digital technologies are non-neutral. You think about even that story that came out last year with Frances Haugen, the whistleblower from Facebook. Like, these companies, the way they design, and I'm not here to bash the company itself, but the way they design their technologies, because they're for-profit companies, they're designed to, booster the bottom line, which is like to generate revenue and income. Well, what the research and psychology is showing is that means the medium needs to be designed in a particular way to keep us engaged, to keep us addicted, really. And a lot of that's driven by vitriol or voyeurism or any number of really unhealthy things. So long story short, the technologies and the mediums are not neutral. They're not neutral. They're designed to grab a hold of our attention in a particular way to keep us scrolling and swiping and sharing and liking. And so that is shaping us. It has a formative power over us, especially because unlike previous technologies, I would say unlike any technology before in human history, there is a ubiquity and pervasiveness to digital technology that we have never experienced before. Anybody listening to or watching this podcast will relate to this. Any moment of boredom you have, what do? Like uncontrollably, your hand starts reaching for that phone. And for no good reason. Like you have no other reason than to squelch your boredom. And we've never had a technology like that before. So, there's an insidious sort of danger to it that I think we have to pay attention to.
Yeah, there is a significant formative difference between spending 30 minutes reading theology out of a book versus spending 30 minutes scrolling theological insights from TikTok.
Yes.
Like they're going to form your brain differently. Even though it's 30 minutes and it's theological content, the form makes a huge, huge difference. And yeah, we'll get into the boredom thing in a second, because that's something I come back to over and over again in places I go. Okay, the new book is structured around, it's a really fantastic structure. You basically just walk through the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5, contrasting an element that Paul lists in that verse that is supposed to be true of the believer who's walking in step with the Spirit, with what gets cultivated through engagement with digital technology and social media.
Yep.
So, for example, in the very beginning, the first attribute Paul lists is love, and you contrast that with what you call self-centric despair.
Yep.
And that's probably language most people aren't familiar with. I wasn't familiar with it.
Yeah.
Define what you mean by self-centric, and how is that different from self-centered?
Yeah. I make that distinction in the book. You know, when you think self-centered, I think most of the time we think arrogant, narcissistic. We think about people who all they can do is talk about themselves, prop themselves up. So that's why I didn't use the word self-centered. And instead I use self-centric, because I think in the digital age, in large part, what's happening is not necessarily that we're all becoming arrogant and narcissistic, although certainly there is quite a bit of that happening. But I think much more pervasively, almost all of us are becoming self-centric, meaning we live with, whether aware of it or not, we live with this constant, relentless, unremitting gaze inward. We are losing our ability to see broadly all of life, to see others clearly. When we look at others, in the digital age, so many of us, I think, look at others through the lens or the filter of an inward gaze. How does that other sort of affect me? Or how do I in my life, how does it compare to the other? You know, rather than a free, open, honest, generous sort of willingness to stop focusing inward, that unremitting, relentless gaze inward, and instead just see life in general and people and circumstances and situations for what they truly are, and to give ourselves to those things. And I think in large part, you know, I get into it in the book, but I think in large part it feels a little simplistic. But the more I've read and the more I've considered my own life, I actually don't think it's simplistic. I think it's just absolutely, utterly, sadly true. I just think in large part this is due to social media. Mm-hmm. You know, and I get that it's a little bit exhausting. Everybody's kind of like bashing social media, and I'm not really here to do that necessarily. I think that I would say there are helpful, redemptive ways to lean into things like social media as a follower of Jesus, and to speak redemptively into those spaces. But I think often what's happening to us instead is that we are being subsumed by the algorithms and by, Tristan Harris says, if nothing is free, if a product is free, it means you are the product, right? And
Right.
his sort of famous, popular documentary, The Social Dilemma. And I think that's what's happened. We've become the products. We've been subsumed by the technology, and we are being sort of sold and bought under the guise of control and freedom. We think we control social media, but in so many ways it controls us. And one of the ways it controls us is it fixes us in this posture of just constant comparison, constant sort of like, all I can do is look at myself and my own life and despair because it doesn't live up to everybody else's sort of glossy, well-curated feeds.
So as I was reading that part of your book, I mean, I don't want to overstate this. I don't think there's anything in your book I can disagree with. There's only some things in the book that I could go, oh, I wish he wrote like 4 more chapters on that because you didn't go far enough down the rabbit hole. So let me go further down this rabbit hole on this idea of being self-centric. In a well-formed Christian life, you need at least these 2 things. On one level, you need to be self-aware. Like we need to be able to retreat into our prayer closet, for example, and in meditation and in collaboration with the Holy Spirit, do good self-reflection, right? Yeah. Search me and know me. Is there any wayward way in me? And be repentant and have that self-knowledge that gives us intimacy with God. What are my fears and struggles and hopes and sins and all that kind of stuff? So self-reflection and self-knowledge is critically important to a healthy spiritual life. But we also need the ability to turn that off and go out into the world and in a way be, in a godly sense, self-forgetful, where we begin to really care about the people around us and put their interests ahead of our own and be truly generous, not just with our resources, but with our lives. And so that's the paradox of the Christian life. What social media seems to do is create the worst of both possible parts of that. Because to your point, it does make us self-centric, but not in a healthy self-knowledge kind of way. It makes us self-obsessed, where I can't help but think about myself and my image all the time. But then it makes us others obsessed, where I'm constantly living in comparison or judging myself in contrast to everyone else. So it takes those 2 critical elements of a healthy spiritual life and makes them both twisted and perverted and backwards. Yeah. And I mean, I don't have an answer for this, but I feel like in my worst moments with social media and these other technologies, it is actively seeking to undo the work of the Holy Spirit in my life and in the world. Yeah. Is that an overstatement?
No, I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's one of the reasons why I tried in the book to juxtapose self-centric despair with love.
Right.
And, I mean, love, I think for some, I think most people have a more sophisticated, sort of deeper understanding of love for sure. But for some, there is that sort of standard pop culture rendering of love, like, oh, love is a feeling. It's a butterflies in your stomach. For most Christians, I think, especially if, you've been going to church for a while or something, most Christians probably have a bit more robust understanding of love. But I think where things really fall apart is not just understanding that love is more than feelings intellectually, but actually embodying that reality. Because in truth, we know love is more than feelings, but we kind of go about our days, most of us, sort of under the guise of like, oh, if I don't feel, loved, then I must not be loved. If I don't feel happy or if I don't feel whatever. And that's problematic in so many ways. It's problematic, but especially in the social media age, it's problematic because social media, it's killing us in a lot of ways, but it's killing us specifically because, like you said, it's sort of pulling out all the most unhealthy parts of us when it comes to some of those things that actually can be quite healthy. So one of the things I think about is, social media is hardwiring us, I think, to want to get love or grab love instead of receive love. A good example of this is the sort of slot machine nature of the constant refresh of social media. You post something and all you want to do is every 2 minutes refresh your screen to see how many more likes. And it is not an accident that the like button on most apps are hearts, which is symbolic of love. Am I loved is essentially what's happening there. And if I didn't get a few more hearts, what's happening even neurologically for me is like I'm not as loved as I hoped I would be. And so we're like grabbing for love. But love is actually not something you grab for. It's something you live open-handed to receive. And ultimately, as followers of Jesus, the bottomless well of love that we can receive at all times is God's love, that he has expressed in the death and resurrection and ascension of his son. But we're so enamored with the constant feed and the accolades and applause of these sort of digital crowds that we're trying to reach, that we've accustomed ourselves to grabbing for love, grabbing for hearts and these likes and shares and all of that. And it's destroying us. I think it's destroying us because it makes it, we are now unable to give love, because the source from which we derive and receive love is so broken. We're just looking to social media and clout and all these things. But if we can begin receiving the love of God, which is a bottomless well, it frees us to live a life that can give love away, and that's actually the path to freedom, I think, from self-centric despair. But we're stuck. So many of us are stuck.
Yeah, we could spend all day walking through every chapter of the book and each of these qualities of the fruit of the Spirit, and we'll maybe touch on one or two more. But before we run out of time, I want to make sure we kind of take a step back. As I read the book and agreed with the book, one of the thoughts I had is the reason this is so difficult for me and for us is because we are in an environment, we are in a society, in communities where everyone is digitally connected all the time. And to begin to put boundaries on these things, healthy boundaries where we can, begin to cultivate those good practices again and healthy rhythms is so incredibly difficult to do as an individual.
Yeah.
And I know your previous book, Analog Church, got into this more, but like what are some things that you are doing as a household or in your church community to help support individuals who do want to cultivate the fruit of the Spirit rather than, the fruit of digital toxicity, to actually do this together? Because like nobody had to convince me to get a smartphone and well, someone did have to convince me to get on Twitter, and I blame Ed Stetzer for that. But it like we just flow with the cultural current, and you find yourself in this. You have to be very intentional to go against that current. It's hard to do it by yourself. So what are you doing as a pastor, father, husband, just in your role of influence to help others find the strength to go against that current?
Yeah. I wish I had some brilliant genius idea that could solve the problem. It's really simple. At our church, just as a pastor first, we have a phrase we use on our staff called linger longer. So we're trying really, we're in California, so our weather is awesome for 10 months out of the year. So we have an advantage there. But almost every Sunday, we try to create the language internally again is linger longer spaces. So it costs us a little bit of money and it costs us a lot of time and a lot of energy from our staff. But almost every Sunday there are physically curated spaces with, be it food and drink, games for the kids. We have a little playground here on our church, property. And we just try to create linger longer spaces for people to be physical, tactile, human with one another, beyond just gathering around a sermon or some songs. And then we try to do the same in our family. So we practice digital Sabbath in our family, 1 hour a day at least, and then 1 full day a week. And that's usually Saturdays. So almost every Saturday when I'm home and not traveling, my wife and I will take our 2 young kids on a hike. We'll cook a meal together, and then in the afternoon, we'll almost always have something with either family or friends, and we're completely off digital devices, and we just try to be really human and linger in humanity, the physical sort of analog embodiment of what it means to be human. We try to do that for a full day. So it's just simple things like that. And I think the approach really is based on the thought that I think in a digital age, analog embodied non-digital realities, we've gone so far down the digital path to be embodied with one another for an extended period of time. I think for many of us is almost like an acquired taste, you know, and we have to acquire the taste again, which means we've got to just practice it, you know, even if it's boring sometimes. So that's what we're trying to do, and takes a long time, but it's worth it.
So this is another example where I feel like really happy and proud of what you're doing, and yet it fills me with despair at the same time. And here's what I mean by it. Like, everything you're describing, both about your family life and what you're doing at the church, and I love the term linger longer. It's great. Like, we all understand how counterintuitive and countercultural that is right now. Like, it does take a great deal of intentionality, and I applaud you and your team for doing that work. It is hard, and we should all do it. Here's the despair part. Like, if I were to get in a time machine and go back to Sky when he entered seminary in 1998, and I were to tell myself, hey, listen, in 25 years, the biggest struggle you're going to have in ministry is getting human beings in a space together for eye contact and actual conversation. That's going to be, and if you're able to do that, that's going to be considered like a huge win in ministry. Like, we've set the bar so low for what we consider successful or countercultural ministry that, like, it reminds me of my son, who's 17 now. When he was born, he had a lot of health problems. He was premature and lots of struggles. And it was a battle getting him to keep an ounce of formula in his body, right? Because he would puke it up all the time. And my wife and I, like, we just struggled through that first year of his life trying to get this kid to eat and grow. And when he would have like 3 ounces of formula, we'd be like celebrating because, and given his condition, you're like, yeah, that's a big win. But any normal child, you'd be like, that's it. You're excited because they ate 3 ounces of, but that's kind of where we are now. Forget like Paul talking about going from milk to meat. We're like on an IV drip trying to keep disciples from going under. So it's really encouraging what you're doing on one level because you're showing and modeling what this can look like in the digital age. But on another level, man, we are so far from just basic healthy humanity, let alone making disciples.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I think if you think about it that way, it can be depressing. I think thinking about it that way essentially means we are thinking about it juxtaposed against the backdrop of the long arc of Christian history, for sure.
Right.
So it's depressing to think back like, oh man, where are the, Augustines and the, Teresa of Avila's and Father Damien of Molokai? Like, where are those people? I'm just trying to get people to show up and sit for 20 minutes and have a hot dog and talk to each other. Like, it's pretty lame, But so that can be depressing for sure. Where I find a lot of hope is, and the digital age actually is dangerous in this way too. Especially, Sky, you're a public figure. Your work is very public. My work is somewhat not as public, but somewhat public. And I think what that can do is, it can sort of fix my gaze on that distant horizon where there's the sort of unreachable masses, and if I could just do the work, reach and relevance and all these sort of like big words in Christendom, and, like for me, where I find a lot of hope is, some of my work is public, but primarily God has called me to a particular people within proximity. Not my focus needs not be on, it shouldn't be on like reach way out there on the horizon, but it needs to be about proximity, like right here, the soil beneath my feet. And what is the slow, small thing God is doing here? And when I think about it that way, I actually find a lot of hope, and I find a lot of joy, and I find a lot of groundedness. It can be a little depressing to say, oh my gosh, why aren't these people becoming more Christ-like and changing the world for Jesus? Mm-hmm. That can be a little frustrating, but ultimately, for me, it's like, oh, this buddy in my small group, he made one small change and he's a better dad today in Jesus than he was yesterday. Now, if I can find joy in that and then sort of commit for the long haul, Jesus and the scriptures use gardening language. You can't microwave an orange. It takes seasons, right? So I found a lot of hope in that. I'm a gardener, not a, I'm not microwaving spirituality. I'm here to garden and get my hands in the dirt and in the soil. So yeah,
that's a really healthy reminder, and that's what you're hinting at. One of the other dangers of this digital technology, in particular for ministers, it can give us visions of grandiosity because we compare ourselves to others who are out there who have big platforms or massive churches, and the call is to shepherd the sheep that you've been given and to love the ones in front of you as you're to bloom where you're planted, to continue your gardening idea. But and Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 3. He came and planted the seed, Apollos watered it, it's God who causes the growth. And those faithful steps you're taking as a father, husband, pastor, and friend to just create those spaces for people to be fully human and for those relationships to cultivate, I trust that God can do remarkable things, often imperceptible at first, through those human encounters where his spirit is present. And that's what really ministry is about. So we got to be careful of the warping perception that these technologies give us, including in the church. Jay, would you be willing to stick around for a few minutes and continue the conversation? Because there's a couple other topics that I really wanted to talk about we didn't have time for. Is that cool?
Sure, would love to. Yeah.
Okay. For those of you who are Patreon supporters, you're going to get more of this conversation through Patreon. Thank you for your support. If you're not a Patreon supporter, you want to be one because you get more content. And we're going to talk about sex in a minute. So that's definitely worth paying for. For those of you who don't have Jay's book yet, it's Analog Christian, Cultivating Contentment, Resilience, and Wisdom in the Digital Age. I hope you start packaging these books together, the two of them, the Analog Christian and Analog Church, because you should have them both. They're worth having in this. We need wisdom like this in this moment. So, Jay, Kim, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.